Hey everybody, it's Dr. Dickinson. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the EDTPA. If you're new to EDTPA, this is a great place to start. I'm going to be sharing with you what you need to consider, what resources you'll need to gather, and helping you unpack the language and thinking about how you want to get started with designing instruction. So get ready, get your paper and materials, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, as well as share some questions that you have in the comments below. Remember, I'm here to support you. I've been working in teacher education since 2010, and I have also worked as an assessor for the CalTPA. I look forward to supporting you. Everybody, let's get started. We're going to be talking about the EDTPA, some of the key components you need to consider, and then I'm going to be showing you what each task is and helping you backwards map the EDTPA rubrics so that you can pass. Bottom line. All right, everybody. So just so you know, just building a mindset of what this EDTPA is. It's a performance-based assessment in which you need to demonstrate three key pieces: your planning, your instruction, and your assessment. And so within each of those constructs, you need to consider academic language as well as using data to inform instruction, on top of how you justify your planning decisions and analyze your teaching. So in short, what you do is you begin with planning. You use assessment to help you make good choices about how you plan. You look at your content standards, unpack them, and set learning targets for each of your lessons based on those specific skills. While you're doing that, you need to consider, who are my students? What funds of knowledge do they bring into the classroom? And how can I assess my students and monitor them throughout the learning cycle? All right, educators, let's get started. What you need to know: if you are a single subject candidate, you will do 3 performance-based tasks. These are 3 tasks that are together, so it's not a separate 3 entries, but you will do all 3 tasks for single subject, again, starting with planning for instruction and assessment. Then you will videotape yourself and analyze your instruction and how you engage students in learning. Finally, you are going to look at your students' assessment data. So whether it's an exit ticket, a quiz, maybe they're working online, doing an online activity, you need to look at the data, analyze, and make sense of student learning. For multiple subjects, you're also going to plan, instruct, and assess. However, you will do an additional task in either math or English language arts. So if your first 3 performance-based tasks are in ELA for multiple subject, then your additional task will be in math, and vice versa. All right, with that in mind, let's move forward. At any time in the video, feel free to pause, come back, review. Step 1 is gather resources. These resources are going to be available once you register for the EDTPA. There are handbooks for every single subject area. And in those handbooks, you're going to get content-specific pedagogy that you need to take into consideration. For example, in mathematics, you will need to focus on conceptual knowledge and procedural fluency. And always check the EDTPA handbook for what you need to focus on in your subject-specific area. At the end of the handbook is a glossary, because as you go through this handbook, you're going to be like, whoa, there's so many new terms I've never heard of before. All of the terminology is unpacked in that glossary. Of course, feel free to add a comment here, and I will answer any questions that you have as well. Another wonderful resource is the rubric level progression. So you're evaluated based on rubrics, which means perhaps when I'm doing my assessment, I should include a rubric. That's a good idea. The rubric level progression will tell you what each score, how it's evaluated, and what you will need to do to get to that highest level score on the rubric. So each task has about 5 rubrics. So each of those tasks, so if you think about 3 tasks, each with 5 rubrics, there's a total of 15 rubrics. That's a lot of rubrics. And then finally is templates. EDTPA has crafted templates for you. So when you're going through creating your performance-based tasks, strongly recommend that you use the templates that are provided by EDTPA. Okay, now let's take a look at what you need to put into each of these templates and what you need to think about while you're writing your performance-based assessments, as well as planning instruction. Okay, 2 pieces. One is called an artifact. You hear this word throughout. Artifact is the authentic work completed by you and your students. This is lesson plans, instructional and assessment materials, videotapes of your teaching, and student work samples. Notice the star there. It says your evidence cannot include hyperlinked content, okay? Another thing that you want to be aware of is that if you are taking materials from outside sources, let's say you're going on Desmos or you're borrowing someone's Quizzy, you always want to reference your materials. You can include a JPEG or PDF, and that can be marked as your artifact. And then when you're writing your TPA, your EDTPA, you can reference the artifact that you're talking about. The other piece is the commentary. This is where you describe and explain the artifacts that you've selected and the rationale. Why did you make this choice? Why did you pick this particular activity for your students to engage in? Why did you pick this material or tool for your students to use? And of course, you're going to analyze what you've learned about your teaching practice and your student learning. Remember that cycle of effective teaching includes your analysis, your rationale, and looking at evidence. So as a rule of thumb, when you start thinking about working on this EDTPA, think about if you are a lawyer and you are writing a document briefing to the judge, giving them all the evidence and all the reasons why, you should be ruled in favor of this case. You want to build a beautiful case that has a undeniable amount of evidence. Of course, EDTPA does limit that, so look at those limitations, but make a good case. So what to submit? Student work samples. Just when I shared those artifacts, let's say you do an exit ticket. You will include the work samples for your 3 focus students. Now, we'll be talking about focus students in a moment, so hang tight. You will also summarize the performance for your whole class. So think about how you can represent that summary. You can make a bar graph. You can make a pie chart. You can share the percent proficiency and describe what you use to determine if students have demonstrated mastery of a skill. Also, you're going to submit any rubrics that you created or materials that you use. Don't forget citations. You'll also annotate those tagged video clips. So when you're videotaping yourself, you're going to tag it. You're going to say, here's exactly where I'm creating a safe environment for my kiddos. Okay? It is continuous and unedited and no more than 20 minutes. Okay? You'll also submit those templates and make sure they're completed with explicit reference. I can't say that enough. And there's 2 examples here that I've just highlighted for you. Make it crystal clear. And it's okay if it sounds like you're saying the same thing over and over again. That means you're making it very clear and very explicit to your reader about how are you demonstrating evidence of planning, teaching, and assessment. Okay, a big piece of the EDTPA is academic language. So we're going to unpack this so you have crystal clear understanding. In academic language includes vocabulary. There are 2 types of vocabulary that you want to think about when you start planning. Subject specific. So vocabulary that's related to the content that you're explicitly teaching. So if you're teaching history, you might be doing a unit on the Tang Song Dynasty, and you'll want to highlight all of that subject-specific vocabulary that your students need to understand to make sense of what they're doing. You'll also want to highlight general academic vocabulary, compare and contrast, justify, evaluate, any academic terminology that is used across disciplines that you might need to and should unpack. It's called good teaching. Syntax. This is the rules to organize words or symbols together. You will need to explicitly state how you are demonstrating and utilizing syntax in your instruction. Finally, as we move forward, is discourse. How are your students be talking? How will you structure oral and written language to support your students in engaging with the content? Will they be making viable arguments to share their math solutions? Maybe you can do that with the sentence stem. Are students going to be completing a graphic organizer and doing think, pair, share? So think about the way that language is used by your kiddos, and that can include both written and oral language. All right, you will hear language function and language demand. So let's take some time to unpack these two components. Language function is the purpose for language. So when you start writing your learning task and your central focus, consider the function of language. What is the purpose of language? Maybe you want your students to analyze or summarize or explain or justify. So think about the function. Now, demand, on the other hand, is what you will have your students doing. So think about your tasks and how those tasks require students to interact with language. Again, you can decide if the students are going to be writing a paragraph, graphing an equation, answering discussion board questions, so on and so forth. Maybe they're doing a KWL chart. So what are you asking your students to do to show their understanding of the subject matter? That is what we mean by language demand. The other piece is language function. Now, I've given you several examples here. I'm a big fan of Bloom's taxonomy. So go back and look at Bloom's and then try and identify the key language function. Now, it's very clear in the EDTPA instructions that you will identify a key language function and one essential learning task in your learning segment lesson plans that will provide students with an opportunity to practice the function. So in this instance, less is more. They want you to do, you might have several language functions in your lesson, but just identify one and connect that to your lesson plans. Finally, you will hear the terminology central focus. So think about what you want your students to develop in the learning segment. You'll need to go back and look at your content standards and unpack them here and think about what you want your students to develop as you unpack your standard. Again, you want to focus on perhaps an essential question, a topic, a theme, a skill, something that really connects and is going to be your focus throughout your learning segment. A few key things to consider as you go through your central focus and start crafting that. Connected to the subject matter, period, end. Connected to prior knowledge, so backwards map. I personally love Achieve the Core. It backwards maps all of those content standards for math. So see what prior knowledge and skills your student should have as you begin to design your learning segment. And then also consider how this would be built upon either in a subsequent lesson or in a next grade level, how it connects. So in the example here for second grade, the second grade standard was fluently add and subtract within 20. is built on prior knowledge because we've been talking about strategies. Now we want to move those strategies into fluency. And this is going to provide a building block for multiplication. Okay. Now moving forward, assets. Assets is a huge piece of talking about your learners. So make sure that you're focusing on your students' strengths, and that includes their culture, their traits, their interests, what they enjoy, and their intelligence. So think about multiple intelligences, as well as their experiences and skills. Okay, so I did a unit with my kiddos on area, and many of my students come from families that are in construction. So we built on that. I actually came into the class. You can see it on my YouTube channel with a hard hat and some blueprints. And I'm building on the funds of knowledge of my students to connect to a math content standard. So get creative, think outside the box, but most importantly, think about your learners and what you know. We want to make it crystal clear that, hey, I took the time to get to know my learners and I am designing instruction for my students that I teach. Deficit thinking. This is a big, big no-no. Okay, anything that is negative, stereotypical, based on prejudice, and limits students and their abilities is a deficit thinking. You want to avoid this. It's very crystal clear in the rubrics. This is what could lead to failure. So be aware of your both conscious and unconscious bias. And when in doubt, cross it out. Do not do a whole thing about labels. You don't want to say, oh, well, my students are Title I and they don't have a lot of parent involvement. That is deficit thinking, okay? Think about how you can focus on some of the assets and focus on ways that you can support both students and families. Think about some of the limitations that you can turn into opportunities for growth and articulate that. So be very careful. All right, focus students. You will have 3 focus students. 1 student should be a student that needs some type of social emotional support. It doesn't have to be a student with an IEP or 504. It can be a student that needs some additional support. Again, you want to focus on their interests, their assets, as well as their opportunities for growth. And be very clear about why you selected your students. What is some evidence that you have identified in your conversations with your students, looking at their IEPs, looking at their cumulative folders, talking to special education colleagues, talking to the principal, talking to the parents. Demonstrate evidence like, hey, I'm a detective. I got to know my kiddos. I got to know who they are and what they bring into the classroom and why I focus on them. Because as a teacher, I want to make sure that all of my students are successful. One of your students should be an English language learner. So be mindful that you're looking at whatever assessment measures you are using for your English language learners. So in California, we use the LPAC test. And you can hyperlink on this document to get an unpacking of the LPAC. But think about the language demand for second language learners and what are some of those components. Now, I know you may not be an English language arts teacher, but you should still know about English language development, right? Reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Think about those 4 pieces as you discuss your English language learner and what tools and supports you can provide. Finally, one of your focus students should be a student with an IEP or 504. Make sure it looks like, hey, I went in, I looked at this IEP, I identified their IEP goals, I'm thinking about what recommendations are, what their goals are, and how I'm going to use that to plan instruction, okay? So I've highlighted assets here, as well as evidence of looking at the IEP and using that to inform my instructional decisions. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about the first part of your task, which is planning for instruction and assessment. before we go, make sure you subscribe to our channel. And in the next video, I'll be going through the first segment, which is task 1, and talking all about planning for instruction and assessment.